They expected Americans to triage by flags and uniforms, but in 1945, inside a canvas hospital lit by one humming bulb, they watched an American doctor choose an enemy child first. The ward sat at the edge of what used to be a schoolhouse, now half clinic, half waiting room for whatever came after surrender. Outside, the late summer air smelled like wet wood and engine smoke, and the wind kept worrying the tarps like impatient hands. Inside, everything was quieter than it should have been. The soft clink of metal trays, the papery whisper of gauze, the steady drip of boiled water cooling in a dented enamel pot. The Japanese nurses stood along the corridor wall in a line that looked like discipline and felt like disbelief. Caps clean, sleeves rolled, faces composed the way you learn to be composed when there's no room for panic. They were not here as patients and not quite as staff. They were witnesses, ordered to observe, instructed to learn, and maybe, though no one said it out loud, expected to swallow the lesson without choking on it. At the far end of the room, a desk had been turned into a supply station. Glass vials sat in neat rows. A hand-painted sign in English read sterile, as if language could keep germs at bay. Dr. Henry Whitaker moved through it all without ceremony. He was white, lean, and tired in the particular way that wasn't sleepiness but focus sharpened over months. He didn't posture. He didn't scan faces for approval. He checked the clock on his wrist like a habit and like a promise. Time mattered because people did. Nurse Claire Bennett followed half a step behind, white as well, her hair pinned back, her expression calm but not soft. She carried a basin of warm water as if it were something valuable, because here it was. Her eyes took inventory: hands, towels, clean needles, space. Then did what good eyes do in chaos. They chose order. On the nearest cots, children lay wrapped in blankets borrowed from someone's home. No one spoke the word enemy, but it floated in the room anyway, heavy as humidity. Some of the children had tags tied to their wrists with string. The tags were in different handwriting, different languages, different levels of hope. A Japanese nurse, her name stitched in small characters on her uniform, kept her gaze fixed on Whitaker's hands. She was waiting for the moment Americans always arrived in stories. Loud, decisive, certain of their own righteousness. What she saw instead was quiet procedure. Whitaker washed his hands for a full count, rubbing soap into every crease as if he were cleaning away more than dirt. Bennett set the basin down with a controlled, careful motion. The bulb overhead flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere outside, a truck backfired, and nobody flinched. They had no flinch left. On a cot near the center, a small child lay with a damp cloth on their forehead, breathing shallow but steady. A tag hung from the wrist, a word in Japanese, another in English, and a final note that didn't need translation: urgent. The nurses along the wall watched Whitaker approach, and in that half-second, the ward held its breath. Surely he would pass by, they thought. Surely he would go to the next cot, the one marked for friendly hands. But he stopped here. He looked at the child. He looked at the tag. Then he said only two words, plain as a command and gentle as a standard. This one. Whitaker did not raise his voice, but the room still rearranged itself around his decision. Bennett stepped in first, setting the basin within reach, the water steaming faintly in the cool air. She laid out a folded towel, a strip of clean gauze, and a small bottle with a handwritten label, her motions economical as if she could save lives by saving seconds. The Japanese nurses along the wall remained perfectly still, yet their attention tightened, the way fabric tightens when pulled. One of them swallowed. Another pressed her fingers together until her knuckles paled. Whitaker leaned over the child and checked the pulse at the wrist with 2 fingers, not 3, not 1, as though even the number of fingers mattered. His eyes moved from the child to the tag and back again, then to the ceiling for half a beat, calculating. Bennett watched his face for the smallest signal and saw none, only that calm, fixed concentration that made people feel as if chaos had boundaries. He spoke again, not to the observers, but to the work itself. Warm cloth. Bennett lifted the damp cloth from the child's forehead, wrung it out into the basin, and replaced it with a warmer one, careful not to startle. The child's eyelids fluttered, then settled. Whitaker's hands moved to the blanket, loosening it just enough to examine without exposing more than necessary. He did not look up at the Japanese nurses. He did not look down on them either. He behaved as if their presence changed nothing, and somehow that was the most unsettling thing in the room. On the next cot, a different child coughed, and a Japanese nurse shifted her weight, almost stepping forward before catching herself. The sound was not dramatic, only human, but it drew a line through the air. This was still their world too. Bennett heard it, glanced once, then returned her attention to the child Whitaker had chosen. She set a rolled towel under the small arm to keep it steady. The movement was gentle, practiced, and it carried a message that did not need translation. You are safe enough for someone to be careful with you. Whitaker opened his kit. The metallic click of clasps echoed louder than it should have. He selected instruments with the same thought he might give to a compass and fog. Bennett offered them without asking. He accepted without thanks. Not because he was ungrateful, but because gratitude could wait and breath could not. The Japanese nurses watched the exchange and tried to find a hidden motive. Was it performance for superiors, a public lesson, a cruelty disguised as kindness, a way to win something without firing a shot? But Whitaker's face stayed neutral, and Bennett's eyes stayed honest, and the work stayed work. Outside the tarp wall, voices passed in the distance, low and indistinct, and a generator coughed, then steadied. Inside, Whitaker leaned closer, listening to the child's breathing as if it were a code. He looked briefly at Bennett. Not a glance of romance, not a glance of drama, just a professional question spoken without words. Bennett answered with a single nod and placed her fingertips exactly where he needed support. One of the Japanese nurses finally spoke, softly, in English shaped by effort. Why first? It was not an accusation. It was a doorway. Whitaker did not turn fully toward her, but he answered with the plain truth Americans used when they had no patience for speeches. Because this one cannot wait. Bennett lifted the child's hand for a moment, aligning the tag so it would not twist the wrist. The Japanese nurse's eyes followed that small care. And for the first time in the ward, disbelief cracked enough to let something else in. The idea that a rule could exist that was older than uniforms. After Whitaker said it, the sentence hung in the air like a new rule nobody had voted on. Because this one cannot wait. The Japanese nurse who had spoken did not reply. Her lips pressed together, not in anger, but in the careful way someone holds back a lifetime of training from colliding with what her eyes were now seeing. Bennett kept her hands steady, her fingertips light where they needed to be light, firm where they needed to be firm. She did not perform kindness. She practiced it. The child's breathing eased by fractions, the smallest measurable victory, and Whitaker responded the way he always did, not with relief, but with the next step. He asked for a tourniquet, and Bennett placed it in his palm. He asked for a syringe, and she held it up, so he could check the measurement without moving his focus from the child's face. The numbers mattered. In a place like this, the difference between 1 milliliter and 2 was not academic. The bulb hummed. The generator outside kept its stubborn rhythm, and somewhere beyond the tarp a voice called out a name that no one inside answered. The Japanese nurses watched the timing more than the technique. They watched how Whitaker did not hesitate, how Bennett did not wait to be told twice, how both of them moved as if the room itself was a clock they were determined not to waste. One of the nurses, younger than the others, shifted closer to the supply table, drawn by the pattern of order. She stopped before crossing an invisible line, then lowered her eyes to the instruments laid out with American precision. They were not fancy, not polished, just clean and ready. She noticed Bennett's hands. No jewelry, no flourish, nails trimmed short, hands that had learned to be gentle without being fragile. The younger nurse looked at her own hands and, for a moment, seemed surprised they belonged to her. Whitaker's eyes flicked toward the row of observers again, not to challenge them, but to include them in reality. You can help, he said, and the Japanese nurses stiffened, unsure if it was permission or a trap. Bennett understood the hesitation. She had seen it in new trainees back home, in men who had never taken orders from a woman, in families who did not trust hospitals. Fear wore different uniforms, but it always sounded the same. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bar of soap, the kind issued by the crate, wrapped in plain paper. She set it on the table near the enamel basin, then stepped back half a foot, opening space without announcing it. It was a quiet invitation. Wash your hands. Come closer. Be useful. The older Japanese nurse glanced at the soap as if it were a rare object. The younger nurse looked from the basin to Whitaker's face and saw no impatience there, only expectation. She moved. Slowly. She rolled up her sleeves another inch, dipped her hands into the warm water, and scrubbed the way Whitaker had scrubbed, mimicking the count without knowing the numbers. Bennett watched her and did not correct her. Whitaker watched too and did not praise her. They let the act itself be the lesson. When the young nurse finished, water dripping from her wrists, she hesitated with her hands held up, fingers spread, waiting. Bennett handed her a towel. Their eyes met for a single beat. No smiles, no speeches, just recognition. Whitaker nodded once toward the cot. "Hold here," Bennett said, placing the young nurse's fingers exactly where pressure would steady the arm. The young nurse obeyed, startled by how natural it felt to be trusted. Along the corridor wall, the older nurses did not move, but their posture shifted. It was the smallest surrender, not of pride, not of loyalty, but of certainty. And in that shift, the ward felt a little less like a battlefield and a little more like a place where a child could be treated as a child. The young nurse's hands trembled at first, not from weakness but from the shock of being placed inside the moment instead of outside it. Bennett kept her voice level, as if steadiness could be taught through tone. "Do not squeeze," she said. "Just hold." The nurse adjusted, easing her pressure until the child's arm stopped pulling away. Whitaker watched the change and gave a short nod that meant the same thing in every language. "That is right." Along the wall, the older nurses tracked every detail like accountants of dignity. They noticed that Whitaker did not bark orders. They noticed that Bennett did not treat the Japanese nurse like an assistant and did not treat her like a student either. She treated her like a pair of hands that mattered, which was almost harder to accept. The ward moved forward by inches. Whitaker checked the child's color, listened again, then looked to the next cot, where another child waited under a blanket that smelled like laundry soap and smoke. There was no dramatic pause, no announcement. He simply pivoted, because the work did not allow for ceremony. Bennett stayed with the first child, adjusting the cloth on the forehead, lifting a cup of water to the child's lips in a slow measured tilt. The child swallowed, and the small sound carried farther than it should have in that quiet room. The Japanese nurse holding the arm heard it and blinked fast, as if she could clear her thoughts the way she cleared fog from a mirror. She glanced at the tag again. The word enemy sat there like a stain that would not wash out. Yet the child's face did not look like an enemy. It looked like a child who wanted to go home. Whitaker moved to the second cot and began the same clean ritual: hands, tools, assessment. The younger nurse hesitated as if torn between duty and gravity, then released her hold carefully when Bennett signaled that she could. She stepped back, keeping her hands up, still wet, still clean. One of the older nurses finally broke formation. She was middle-aged, posture straight, expression controlled, and she walked to the supply table with the same precision she might have used to enter a commander's office. Her eyes did not go to Whitaker. They went to the soap. She lifted it, turned it over in the paper, then set it down again as if acknowledging that it belonged to no one now. She washed her hands in the basin with deliberate thoroughness, counting in her head to a rhythm only she could hear. When she finished, she did not ask permission. She simply stood beside Bennett, hands raised, ready. Bennett looked at her for a second, then handed her a roll of gauze. Not as a gift, not as a prize, but as a task. The older nurse accepted it with both hands, a subtle gesture of respect that did not flatter, and did not surrender. Whitaker's voice cut through the quiet, still calm, still flat. "We have 5 more," he said, reading the row of cots like a map. The number landed hard. 5 more. In a city, it would be nothing. Here it was a wall. Bennett glanced at the instruments and saw how little there was left, how every clean bandage was a decision, how every bottle would run out. She reached under the table and pulled out a folded army blanket, shaking it once to free it from its tight pack. She laid it near the cots and smoothed it with her palms, making a place for the next child, a place that looked prepared. Preparedness was a kind of mercy. The Japanese nurses washed her hands and realized the Americans were not just treating bodies. They were building a system in a ruined room, laying down a standard that did not care who had won the war. Outside, the wind lifted the tarp again, and light sliced through a seam, bright for a moment, then gone. Inside, the older nurse leaned toward Bennett and spoke softly, almost as if speaking might break the fragile new order. Our rule was different, she said. Bennett did not correct her. She did not debate. She only answered with the simplest truth she had left. The wound does not know the flag, she said, and then she turned back to the next set of hands waiting to be guided. Whitaker's sentence, 5 more, did not sound like panic, but it carried the weight of math in a room that had run out of room. Bennett looked at the supply table again and saw the true map of the day. Half a roll of gauze, 3 clean syringes, a bottle of disinfectant with the label smudged by too many hands, and a stack of bandages that had been cut down and cut down again until they were more idea than cloth. The Japanese nurses saw it too. Scarcity was a language all of them spoke fluently. The older nurse who had washed her hands stepped closer to the table and began sorting without being asked, aligning items by size, by cleanliness, by what could be used twice without becoming unsafe. She did it quietly, and her efficiency was so natural it almost looked like defiance. Bennett let her. Whitaker did not glance over. He simply continued, because the point was not to make a show of cooperation. The point was to get through the next hour without losing what little they could still save. A child on the far cot began to whimper, the sound thin and exhausted rather than loud. The younger nurse who had helped first turned toward it instinctively, then stopped, waiting for instruction as if her own instincts had become suspect. Bennett caught her hesitation and answered it with a small gesture, 2 fingers pointing to the enamel pot. More warm water, she said. The young nurse moved at once, relieved to have a job that made sense. She carried the pot with both hands, careful not to spill, and the older nurses watched her leave the wall, watched the line break, watched the world shift without collapsing. Whitaker stepped to the next child and measured the distance between what he needed and what he had. His voice stayed even. We ration time, not care, he said, not as a slogan, but as a reminder to himself. Bennett understood. Time could be rationed in minutes. Care could not be. She unfolded the army blanket again and placed it under a small shoulder, lifting the child just enough to make breathing easier. The movement was so gentle that the child did not startle, only blinked and looked at her face as if searching for an answer. Bennett did not promise anything. She only stayed present, because presence was the only promise she could keep. Near the door flap, the older Japanese nurse heard footsteps outside and stiffened. Voices came closer, male voices, urgent, in Japanese. For a moment the ward tightened again, as if the old hierarchy might burst through the tarp and demand its old order back. The nurse's eyes darted to Whitaker, then to the children, then to the tags. Bennett saw the fear rise like a tide. She reached to the supply table and picked up a plain army form, the kind used for inventories, and laid it down in front of the older nurse. She placed a pencil beside it. Right? She said, keeping her tone low. List what you need, what you can find, what you can make. The older nurse stared at the paper, then at Bennett. A form was not a weapon, but it was power. It was a way to speak. In a system that listened to paper more than people. The nurse took the pencil and began to write in careful characters, translating need into lines and numbers. Gauze, soap, clean water, blankets, milk. The list was not political. It was human. Whitaker glanced over and saw the paper, and for the first time his mouth softened at the corner, not into a smile, but into agreement. Good, he said. Outside, the footsteps passed without entering. The voices faded. The ward exhaled. The young nurse returned with warm water and set it down. Bennett dipped a cloth, wrung it out, and placed it on another child's forehead. The cloth was not medicine, but it was comfort, and comfort kept small bodies from wasting strength on fear. The older nurse kept writing, each stroke steadier than the last. The line of observers was gone now. In its place was a small, quiet team assembled in the only way that mattered, by necessity and by choice. And as Whitaker moved from cot to cot, he did not look for allegiance. He looked for signs of life, and he treated them as if they were his responsibility, because in that room, for that hour, they were. The list the older nurse wrote did something Whitaker could not do with a scalpel. It made need visible without begging. Bennett watched the pencil move, each character placed with the same discipline the nurse had carried down the corridor, and she recognized it as another kind of tree-off. Not bodies this time, but the fragile chain that kept bodies alive. Whitaker finished with the next child and stepped back just enough to reset his hands and his mind. He looked at the paper again, then reached into his bag and pulled out a small stamped packet of field forms. He slid them across the table toward the nurse, along with a carbon sheet, as if saying, "If you are going to speak to my system, here is its language." The older nurse's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed into focus. She began copying the list onto the American form, line by line, translating not just words, but urgency. Gauze became inches. Water became gallons. Blankets became counts. Milk became a question mark, then a number, because children did not live on questions. The younger nurse hovered near Bennett, watching her hands and learning by watching, which was the oldest kind of schooling. Bennett filled a cup, tested it against her wrist, and offered it to a child with both hands so the cup would not shake. The child drank a few sips and stopped. Bennett did not insist. She understood that bodies in shock made their own rules. "That is enough," she said softly, and the younger nurse repeated the phrase under her breath, tasting the English like it was medicine too. Outside the tarp wall, the afternoon shifted. The light grew flatter, more gray, and dust moved through it in lazy spirals. A jeep rolled by, and the vibration ran through the floorboards, rattling the instruments on the tray. The metallic sound made several Japanese nurses glance toward the entrance again, old reflexes pulling their eyes to authority. Then they looked back at the children and saw a different authority in the room now, the authority of competence. Whitaker spoke without looking up, as if talking to time itself. "Next," he said. Bennett gestured to the older nurse. "Wash again," she said, and the nurse did, even though her hands were already clean, because in this room procedure was not punishment. It was protection. The younger nurse followed suit, scrubbing quickly, then more slowly, matching Bennett's steady pace. No one had told her that discipline could be gentle. She was discovering it in warm water and plain soap. A child near the back cot began to breathe faster, eyes wide, and the older nurses tensed, ready to hold the child down the way they had been taught to hold patients still. Bennett lifted her palm, a small stop sign. "No," she said, not harsh, just firm. She reached into a pocket and produced a folded square of cloth, clean, plain. She placed it in the child's hands instead. "Hold this," she said. The child gripped the cloth like a lifeline. Hands busy meant fear had less room to spread. The older nurses watched, surprised by the simplicity. Whitaker glanced up, saw what Bennett had done, and approved without speaking. He adjusted the blanket at the child's shoulders, keeping the body covered, keeping dignity intact even in a crowded ward. The older nurse finished copying the list and held the paper out with both hands, offering it the way one offers an important document at a formal table. Bennett took it, then did something the nurse did not expect. She handed it right back, pointing to the space at the bottom for a signature. "Your name," Bennett said. The nurse hesitated. Signing could be dangerous in a world where responsibility was a blade. But she wrote it anyway, careful and clear. In that moment, she stopped being an observer and became a recorded part of the solution. Whitaker took the paper next and added his own signature beneath hers, American ink under Japanese strokes, then folded it once and tucked it into his pocket as if it were a promise he intended to keep. "We will push this," he said. Today. The word today mattered. It meant the need was not theoretical. The team moved again, cot to cot, cloth to forehead, pressure to wrist, water to lips. And as the afternoon dimmed, something else brightened in the room. The quiet understanding that saving a child did not belong to any one flag, and neither did the responsibility for what came after. As dusk pressed its flat gray light against the tarps, the ward began to sound different. Not louder, but steadier. Less like a place holding its breath, and more like a place doing its job. Whitaker's pocket held the signed request form like a weight he did not intend to set down, and Bennett's hands kept moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that calm could be contagious. The Japanese nurses, once lined up like a verdict, were now distributed through the room like stitches holding a seam together. The younger nurse carried warm water again, moving around cots without bumping knees, learning the map of bodies and blankets. The older nurse checked the stack of cut bandages, rationing inches the way people rationed rice, then looked to Bennett for a nod before tearing another strip. Bennett gave it, because trust was now part of the supply chain. Near the entrance flap, two figures appeared and paused, silhouettes against the dim. They wore Japanese uniforms, not medical, but official enough to bring old tension back into the room. One of the Japanese nurses stiffened automatically, shoulders lifting, chin tightening, as if she were back in a lecture hall with a superior judging her posture. The men spoke in low Japanese, their tone clipped, and several nurses glanced at Whitaker's back as though waiting for him to react, waiting for the Americans to turn this into a lesson with sharp edges. Whitaker did not. He continued working, eyes on a child's breathing, hands steady. Bennett glanced toward the doorway once and returned to her task without drama. That was the message. The children were the priority, not the visitors. The two men stepped inside and their eyes swept the room, noting the American doctor, the American nurse, the Japanese nurses now assisting, and the tags tied to wrists. The older nurse felt the danger in that sweep. In her world, evidence could be weaponized. A superior could decide that helping the Americans meant disloyalty. She reached for the instinct to step back, to return to the wall, to become invisible again. Then she remembered the signature on the form. Her name was now attached to a request for soap and gauze and milk. It was attached to the idea that children did not belong to flags. She did not step back. She stepped forward to the supply table and began preparing another clean cloth, as if that cloth were her answer. One of the men spoke sharply. The older nurse replied, her voice controlled, not pleading, not defensive. She pointed to the list on the table, to the count of bandages remaining, to the enamel pot, to the cups, to the cots. She did not argue policy. She presented facts. Whitaker finally looked up, just once, and spoke in English the way you speak to someone at a counter, not the way you speak to an enemy. We need supplies, he said. We are treating children. All of them. Bennett did not translate. The older nurse did, choosing her words carefully, giving the sentence a shape that would not inflame pride. The men listened, eyes narrowing, calculating what this cooperation would mean outside the tarp walls. One of them glanced at a child whose tag carried that hated word, then at the child's face. For a moment, his expression faltered. It was not kindness yet. It was confusion, which was the first crack in certainty. The younger nurse, hands full of warm cloths, stood very still, afraid that movement might draw attention. Bennett noticed and made space for her, guiding her to a cot with a quiet gesture, keeping her useful and out of the line of judgment. Whitaker returned to the child in front of him, finished a careful check, then moved to the next. The two men watched for several seconds longer, then spoke again in Japanese, lower now. The older nurse answered in the same steady tone. When the men finally stepped back out through the flap, the ward did not collapse into relief. It simply continued. That was the real change. The fear was still there, but it no longer ran the room. Bennett placed a fresh cloth on a small forehead. Whitaker adjusted a blanket. The older nurse counted bandages again. The younger nurse carried water with both hands. And in the dim, with the war still in the air outside, a quiet new order held. The work came first, and the work was human. Night settled fully, and the ward became a small island of lamplight surrounded by quiet streets and unseen watchers. The humming bulb above the center cot cast a pale circle on faces and hands, turning every movement into a shadow play. A hand lifting a cup, a cloth being wrung out, a pencil set down beside a form, a blanket pulled up to a chin. Whitaker checked his watch again and saw that he had been working in straight lines for hours, moving from cot to cot like a man tracing a grid. Bennett stood near the supply table, counting what remained, then counting what could be made to remain. The older Japanese nurse watched Bennett's counting and understood it intimately. Counting was not stinginess. Counting was survival. The younger nurse returned from the doorway with news carried in her posture before she spoke. Footsteps, American this time, heavier boots, the sound of crates being shifted. A moment later, the flap lifted and a U.S. medic stepped in with a small canvas bag and two boxes, not large, but real. The room changed without a word. Not because everyone suddenly felt hopeful, but because need had been acknowledged. Whitaker walked over, took one look, and did not celebrate. He simply started opening the boxes with the same calm as if he were opening a drawer. Inside were rolls of gauze, a tin of antiseptic, a stack of sterile bandages, and a small carton of powdered milk with English printed in bold letters. Bennett touched the carton lightly, as if verifying it was not a rumor. The older Japanese nurse saw the milk and inhaled as though she had been holding her breath since afternoon. The medic nodded once to Whitaker, then to Bennett, then to the Japanese nurses with a quick, uncertain politeness. He had expected a ward divided. He found a ward working. The older nurse reached for the supply form with her signature and held it up, showing it like proof of process. Whitaker did not take it. He tapped the paper with one finger and said, "This got here." Bennett understood what he was really saying. Someone listened. Someone moved. Systems could still function even in ruins. The younger nurse approached the milk carton with careful hands. Bennett measured the water in a metal cup, not with a perfect measuring spoon, but with experience, keeping it warm, not hot. She mixed the powder slowly until it dissolved, watching for clumps, then tested a drop on her wrist. The younger nurse watched as if seeing alchemy. Bennett handed her the cup and guided her fingers around it. "Slow," she said. "Small sips." The younger nurse carried it to the child on the nearest cot, kneeling so her face was not towering, so her hands did not look like an order. The child sipped, paused, then sipped again. The sound was quiet and steady, a normal sound in a room that had been full of abnormal. Whitaker returned to the cots with fresh bandages and moved faster now, not frantic, but unburdened by scarcity. The older Japanese nurse began organizing the new supplies with a method that was almost beautiful, lining them up by size and use, making a small inventory list in both Japanese and English. Bennett did not correct her spelling. She did not need to. The effort was the bridge. Near the back cot, a child stirred and looked around with sleepy confusion, eyes settling on the cluster of adults. For a brief moment, the child's gaze landed on the Japanese nurse holding the cup. The nurse's face softened before she could stop it. Not sentiment, not weakness, just the natural expression of someone who has chosen care while being watched. At the entrance, the American medic lingered, then cleared his throat. "You all need anything else?" he asked. Whitaker glanced toward the list, then toward the children. "More water," he said. "And blankets if you can." Bennett added quietly, "Soap." The medic nodded and left, the flap dropping behind him. The older Japanese nurse looked at Whitaker, then at Bennett, then back at the children, and something settled into place inside her. The Americans had not just treated the enemy first. They had made that choice visible, repeatable, and backed by paperwork and supply. It was no longer a single shocking act. It was a standard that could outlast the moment. And in that realization, the old rule in her head began to lose its grip. The rule that said compassion must always follow allegiance. By the time the generator outside coughed into a quieter rhythm and the night air cooled the canvas walls, the ward had slipped into a rare kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of work completed for the moment. Whitaker stood at the end of the row of cots and let his shoulders drop half an inch, the closest he came to admitting exhaustion. Bennett rinsed her hands, dried them on a clean towel, and folded the towel into a neat square as if order could be stored for later. The Japanese nurses moved with less hesitation now, not because their world had become safe, but because their hands had learned a new muscle memory. Hold here, warm cloth, small sips, wash again. The older nurse closed the supply box and wrote a final line on her inventory list, then set the pencil down carefully, parallel to the paper, a quiet signature of pride. The younger nurse checked the milk cup, wiped the rim, and placed it back on the table where it would not tip, then looked toward the first child Whitaker had chosen earlier. The child slept, breathing more evenly, the blanket tucked under the chin the way someone tucks a blanket for a child at home. Bennett noticed the way the tag had been adjusted so it did not pull at the wrist. The word that had caused so much tension still sat there, but it no longer ruled the room. It was just ink on paper, and paper was not stronger than breath. Outside, faint footsteps approached again, slower than before. The flap lifted and one of the Japanese officials from earlier appeared, alone this time, his posture less rigid, his eyes more tired than sharp. He looked at the cots, the supplies, the American forms on the table, the Japanese handwriting beside English lines. He did not speak at first. He did not need to. The room showed him what had happened. Whitaker stepped forward and offered him the simplest status report possible. "Stable," he said, nodding toward the children. Bennett did not embellish. She only added, "They will need food and clean water in the morning." The official's gaze moved to the milk carton and paused. He swallowed, the same small swallow the nurses had made hours earlier, and his voice came out quieter than his uniform suggested. He spoke in Japanese to the older nurse, asking a question that sounded like permission and sounded like fear. The older nurse answered without flinching. She pointed to the supply list, then to the children, then to Whitaker's signature beneath her own. She did not accuse. She did not apologize. She simply stood inside the truth she had helped create. The official's eyes flicked to Whitaker, and for a brief second the war stood between them like a wall. Then the official lowered his gaze to the forms, to the neat lines, to the ink. Paper again. Process again. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then stepped back out without further argument. When the flap fell closed, the ward did not celebrate. It only continued to breathe. Whitaker returned to the first cot and checked the child's pulse one more time, quick and gentle. Bennett adjusted the lamp so the light did not shine directly into sleeping eyes. The younger nurse gathered used cloths into a small pile for washing. The older nurse took a blanket edge that had slipped and tucked it back into place, smoothing it with her palm in a motion so ordinary it felt like rebellion against the past. Whitaker glanced at Bennett and spoke in a low voice meant only for her, but loud enough that anyone listening could learn from it. "We did not win anything tonight," he said. Bennett looked at the children, then at the Japanese nurses, then at the quiet order in the room. "No," she replied. "We just did what was right." The older nurse heard the tone, even if she did not catch every word. She looked at Bennett's face, at the calm, and understood the point without translation. Dignity did not need permission. It only needed someone willing to live it. And in that canvas ward, under one humming bulb, the standards shifted without a speech, without a flag raised, without a single shout. They shifted because a child had been treated first, and the world had not ended. It had, in a small way, begun again.